Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. Now, this is the only show that dares to ask, what if Europe's most glamorous singing competition was also a proxy war for post-Soviet politics? Now, in this episode, we'll be talking about Eurovision from the Eastern perspective. Every year, Europe gathers to celebrate three things: questionable taste, weaponized ballads, and the ever-present pyrotechnics engulfing the stage. But behind the rhinestones and key changes, there's a darker track playing. One where Georgia censors protests, Azerbaijan glares at Armenia enviously, and Ukraine sings its heart out while there's air raid sirens blaring back home. The stage unites them, but offstage, they're separated by everything from landmines to frozen conflicts to Russian boots on the ground. So, without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
The 69th edition of the Eurovision Song Contest is over, with Austria claiming this year's title. Although the final showdown between the Austrians and Israel is what drew the most attention, there was more to this year's edition than just songs. Ukraine, for example, continues to score in the top 10. While this year's performance by Zifferblatt's 9th place finish is a far cry from the Kalush Orchestra's 2022 win, Ukrainian representatives have a very clear goal in mind, as do their fans.
We must carry Ukrainian culture forward. We must show the world and all of Europe who we are. And it's amazing that we are here now and can make our voices heard.
As usual, the song contest is not without its share of controversy. This year, Armenia, Georgia and Azerbaijan came under criticism for their apparent ties with Russia or cultural influences linked with the country. Russia itself has been banned from the contest since 2022 over its full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
And here we have...
Though Georgia and Azerbaijan themselves had failed to qualify for this year's ESC final.
Azerbaijan.
And now let's zone in on the East playing portion of our show. The Eurovision Song Contest has its share of interesting countries added to the mix, such as Australia. In the last few editions, however, there have been two notable absences: Belarus and Russia. Here's more as to why those two BFFs are not allowed to participate.
It is often the case these days that Russia and Belarus are banned from something together, or Minsk follows shortly after. When it came to the Eurovision Song Contest, however, it went a little differently. Belarus was disqualified in 2021 for violating the Song Contest rules, and then after the ESC final, it was expelled from the European Broadcaster Union for not responding to the suspension itself. It is important to note that this situation took place less than a year after the contested 2020 presidential elections in Belarus and a subsequent crackdown of Belarusian authorities on peaceful demonstrations. In Russia's case, however, the matter is more straightforward. In the wake of its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Russian representatives were banned or disqualified from various cultural and sports events. They were expelled from the ESC after several European state broadcasters protested the initial decision to let a Russian representative take part in the contest. Since then, Russia has decided to host its own song contest, which is a revival of the Soviet-era Intervision, the then Eastern Bloc's direct Eurovision competitor.
And now let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. So let's start with the obvious. Ukraine, a country currently performing the rare feat of literally fighting for its life while still managing to send an inspired prog rock entry to Europe's most chaotic music festival. Ukraine's Eurovision entries have long been as close to political as they can without breaching the EBU's anti-politics rule. Now in 2022, Kalush Orchestra won the contest and dedicated their performance to the defenders of Mariupol. And even though this year they placed 9th, Ukraine still gets accused of gaining sympathy votes. And let's move a little to the southeast, to the Southern Caucasus, a region that has more frozen conflicts than a Soviet refrigerator. Armenia and Azerbaijan are like sibling rivals of the Eurovision family, except that the siblings in question had recently fought a war over Nagorno-Karabakh, committed war crimes, and were now exchanging passive-aggressive voting behavior instead of artillery fire. Armenia's entry tend to be introspective, melancholic, and full of unresolved historical trauma, but not this year. With their blaring rock anthem Survivor, they managed to get the 20th spot in the grand final. Meanwhile, Azerbaijan's entries are usually sleek, polished, and really good at getting 12 points from countries that have signed oil contracts with Baku. Now, if you're wondering why those two countries refuse to vote for each other, the answer is they literally can't. In 2009, an Armenian voter was interrogated by Azerbaijani police for voting for his own country. But that brings us to the real wild card here, Georgia. The nation is currently in the throes of a political identity crisis, and this year, the authorities bypassed the voice of the society, as per usual, and instead sent a singer who openly supports the Georgian Dream government. During the performance, white flags were being waved on stage, almost as to send a little nod to those protesting in Tbilisi to just give up. And that's kind of the point. These countries aren't just entering a song contest, they're entering a battle for the symbolic alignment. East versus West, democracy versus autocracy, Putin and company versus literally everyone else. Now, to the untrained eye, Eurovision is just a campy talent show where people vote for whoever's wearing the most sequins or sings the highest notes. But Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Ukraine, it's a stage where you fight for a national identity while exploring regional alliances and sometimes display some authoritarian propaganda. And now, here to share more light on the issue is Paul Jordan, Eurovision expert. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hi there, thanks for having me.
So today we are taking a look at the Eurovision Song Contest, which of course is purely about talent and about nothing else. Is that a fair assessment?
In an ideal world, yes, it would be all about the music, but occasionally politics does come into it. But it is first and foremost a television show. It's been going for nearly 70 years, and it brings people a lot of joy.
Very much so. But today I would like to examine a little bit into the politics of things. And looking at some of the voting patterns, do you think that we can kind of deduce some of the kind of underlyings of geopolitical relation between all these different countries?
I think sometimes yes. So if you look at Azerbaijan and Armenia, for example, the jury votes for those two countries are very interesting. They normally mark each other down in the last place. They do that every year. So that's not necessary. That's political. There's no other explanation for that. There are other things when, Greece and Cyprus, for example, exchange points, but that is sometimes because they know each other's singers and artists. It's not always about politics. But of course, politics can and does come into it. We saw a huge vote for Ukraine in 2022 when Ukraine won. But I would say that's not necessarily political. That was more a showing of solidarity with the people of Ukraine following the invasion by Russia.
All right, there's plenty of discussions and controversies involved as well, starting back, since 2022. Of course, Russia has been barred from participating, and same as Belarus, where also disqualified for political layers of their 2021 entry. Can you tell us a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, so those are two slightly different situations. So Russia were banned following the invasion of Ukraine. Now, technically, they weren't banned for that reason. They were banned for their broadcasting government propaganda, which was against the rules of the European Broadcasting Union, who organised the event. So that was the reason why they were thrown out of the contest, although a lot of people think it was because of the invasion. It is obviously a very fine line between those issues. With Belarus, they refused to change the lyrics of their song. It was all about teaching people a lesson who step out of line. And that was definitely a political song, given that the year before they had protests and crackdown by the Lukashenko government. So it was very much a message from Belarus's government. And Belarus's government have always been very involved in Eurovision. The broadcaster is, more or less a state broadcaster, and they broadcast propaganda as well, which again is against the rules of the competition organisers. It's a tricky line though, because what is political and what is not is sometimes left up to judgment. And technically, a song about world peace could be seen as political.
All right, but there does seem to be some discrepancy between the voting pattern from the viewers and those of the judges. Can that be explained away from different tastes in music genre or how they perceive these performances differently, or do you think that there's also more at play there?
I think there is sometimes a lot at play there. So if you look at the jury results for the United Kingdom, for example, they scored highly with the juries because they were good singers, and yet they scored zero with the public. Now, that was expected. I didn't expect that song to do well with the public, but the juries tend to vote for technical singing ability, which is why Austria won the jury vote. They didn't win the public vote, but of course they won the contest overall. There are other countries like Ukraine that have a huge diaspora now in Europe, and they'll always get those public votes. But there are other countries that perhaps have less neighbours that don't always get the votes. And I think you have to look at Malta's result this year. I think they only got 8 points as an example, even though they were one of the favourites to do very well. So sometimes there is neighbourly voting, but I would say overall, the music is stronger than any politics or neighbourly voting, and that's why it's existed for so long. But Eurovision voting has always been controversial, even since the very first contest, when it was held in Switzerland, and Switzerland indeed won.
All right, now there's also some controversy involving the Israeli performance. People have been saying that there's a possible censorship when it comes to the audience boos. Is that substantiated?
Well, I wasn't in the arena on Saturday, but I was at the semi-final on Tuesday, and I could tell from friends they were messaging me saying that there was a lot of booing for the Israeli entry, and yet we didn't hear that on television. So you could argue that that is censorship, but also I understand it from the perspective of the organisers. They're trying to produce a television show, and it'd be a great shame if performances were hijacked by political opinions, whatever they may be.
Right, so it might actually be the other way around, like trying to make the thing a bit less political than more so. There's also, of course, other interests involved that's being in the discussion as well, where Moroccan Oil, Israel company, is the main sponsor of Eurovision. Do you think that this sort of information would also kind of muddy the water when it comes to the objectivity of some of these judges and results?
I think when it comes to the judges and results, I don't think the sponsors have any bearing. But I think when it comes to the actual organisers behind the scenes, they want to make sure it's fair for everyone. So I don't think they would be influenced by the fact that Moroccan Oil is an Israeli company. That said, sponsorship and participation is important. They want as many countries in the contest as possible. So I think that's why they're possibly this morning breathing a sigh of relief that Israel did not win, possibly because it would have made it very, very complicated next year. Countries may have withdrawn, and it would have been challenging for them to have hosted it in Israel given the current situation. So Austria have won. They had a good song. So did Israel. They had a lot of public votes, a lot of jury votes too. I think overall the music did speak louder than the politics. And what I love about Eurovision is a joyous event. It's taken me to countries I would never go to and would have never been to before. I've met amazing people, and it's sheer fun. It's unique in the television year. There's nothing else like it. And it would be a real shame if it became toxic like it has done in the past few years.
Hey, that's something I'm also pretty curious about watching the Eurovision myself, is that including in the roster of some of the countries that are not really Europe, be it Australia, Israel, or previously Morocco. How do they get into Eurovision?
To enter Eurovision, you need to be a member of the European Broadcasting Union. Now, most of the broadcasters around Europe and on the periphery of Europe, such as North Africa and the Middle East, are members of the European Broadcasting Area. They're eligible to enter. So Israel have been taking part since 1973. Morocco took part once. Azerbaijan debuted in, I think it was 2008. So they're eligible because they fit the criteria. Australia is a slight outlier. Australia is an associate member of the European Broadcasting Union. They're not eligible to enter. However, in 2015, they were invited to take part as a one-off as part of the 60th anniversary celebrations of the contest. They loved it so much, and they've made an exception to the rules for them. And I would say that Australia's participation has brought a lot of energy to the contest and also added extra funding, and they pay a participation fee. And if you have more countries in the contest, it actually means it's cheaper for everyone overall. So Australia have done European countries a favour, even if they weren't necessarily welcome at first. I think it's actually in keeping with the ethos of the contest. Music knows no borders, knows no boundaries, and Australia being part of that, they've got a lot of influences from Europe as well, I think is all in keeping with that spirit of Eurovision.
Now, one of the countries that also drew my attention that kind of got me digging down the political rabbit hole is a performer from Georgia, which performed the song Freedom. The individual in question publicly supports the governing pro-Russian political party Georgian Dream and has performed at their events. But she was also banned from Eurovision back in 2029 for submitting an explicitly anti-Russian song. Do you think that involvement of artists like her and kind of the exclusion also speaks to a bit of a political kind of aspect of this competition?
Yeah, I think it's challenging because most people just want to perform their songs, but like everyone, some people are more political than others, and sometimes artists can be too. With Georgia's entry in 2009, the one that was banned, it was called We Don't Want a Putin. They were asked to change the lyrics of their song and they refused. It depends on context though. That was when it was taking place in Moscow that year, and the Russians had objected to that song. I think if that song had been entered in a contest when it was in Portugal or Ireland, I don't think it would have had the same political connotations. With Georgia this year, she didn't qualify for the grand final. I think she's probably quite unpopular amongst many Eurovision fans as well. I believe she was booed at a concert in Amsterdam, which was like a preview event. Again, it's a great shame. Georgia are very enthusiastic about Eurovision, and I've been many times to the country. It's wonderful, and it just shows you can't necessarily judge people by their governments or indeed by their pop stars.
But how much does that bleed into each other? Like you very rightfully pointed out that a lot of people do judge the artist not for its art alone, but also where they're from, what are their political leanings. Do you think that, and like you mentioned, the boos from the audience side, that has anything also to do with perhaps not the jury's voting pattern, but the audience's voting patterns?
I think so. And it's a fine line between freedom of expression and being overtly political. I think, social media has really opened up those discussions. We're much more aware of what other people think now in a way that we weren't before. But they have introduced a new rule in Eurovision, which is around a code of conduct. So whilst people are free to express their views, to have their opinions, they're only allowed to do that in a respectful way. And what we saw last year, there were quite a few artists who were opposed to Israel's participation in the contest, but their behaviour was perhaps outside of that code of conduct, which is why they've introduced it and clarified it about what expectations they're looking for the artists. I vote for the music, but I do understand that politics does come into it. And you often see slightly strange voting patterns, and sometimes it is difficult to prove. We saw a very low public vote for the Netherlands, and there were allegations that is perhaps based on race. It's very hard to prove. You can also see a lot of the geography of Europe. Often countries like Poland and Lithuania, countries that have large diasporas in Europe, you see those votes coming through. So Poland, for example, gets a lot of points from the UK, as does Lithuania. And I think that's not necessarily about politics, but it's about perhaps Polish people in the UK picking up the phone and wanting to vote for their home country. Although I have to say the Polish entry this year, in my view, was fantastic.
Right. Last but not least, if you have to put it on a scale of kind of comparing how much of this is dominated by politics and how much is pure kind of voting by be it talent, be it performance, would you say it's a 50-50, 70-30? Which way do you think it leans?
I would say 70-30. I think 50-50 jury votes and public votes, and that's why the juries were brought in to counter the so-called neighbourly voting. But if anything, the juries have shown that they're perhaps strange in their own views as well. So I think it comes into it, just like it does with the World Cup when it was in Qatar, the Olympic Games in Beijing. But overall, this is a music contest. It's existed for nearly 70 years, and we're going to have a big party next year in Austria.
All right, thank you so much for your input and insight, and thanks for being with us on Eastern Express. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. According to the website Ukraine Inform, the Ukrainian Defense Intelligence believe that Russia intensified its special doppelganger operation against Poland. Now, this is believed to have taken place during the Polish presidential elections.
The doppelganger operation is one of Russia's largest and longest-running disinformation campaigns that is targeted against EU and NATO member states. The entire operation involves Kremlin special services creating websites and various social media pages that mimic actual Western media in regard to their content and appearance. Through these, the Kremlin spreads disinformation under the guise of credible news. This was, according to Ukraine's defense intelligence cited by Ukrinform, no different in the case of the Polish presidential elections. The social network platform X was to have been one of the primary places where Russian special services spread manipulative or outright false messages. One of the tenets of pro-Russian disinformation campaigns is to craft a negative image of Ukraine or push anti-EU and anti-NATO narratives.
Alexander Shershin, the commander of one of the battalions in Ukraine's 47th Separate Mechanized Brigade, has submitted his resignation. He has criticized Ukrainian top brass over unjustified personnel losses.
Shershin used the term idiotic tasks when apparently referring to some of the orders that have been given by upper command. While he has refused to share the precise details of what these orders entailed, he slammed Ukrainian top brass for a, quote, senseless loss of people, and said that the fear of incompetent generals will lead only to failure. In a direct address to Ukraine's military leadership, he said he hoped their children would also have to serve as infantry and carry out their orders. Shershin and his troops were involved in Ukrainian military operations in the Kursk region. His resignation also comes as negotiations to achieve some sort of peace, or at least a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, are taking place, though without much success in that regard.
Azerbaijan's grand repatriation process to Nagorno-Karabakh seems to have encountered some roadblocks. The numbers apparently don't look too good, despite lots of money being spent on reconstruction.
According to a report published by the Azerbaijani government-connected news outlet Caliber.az, the numbers involved in the repatriation process of Azerbaijani internally displaced persons to territories retaken during the Second Karabakh War are not adding up. In late 2024, the repatriation pace was around 8,000 returnees. There are currently just shy of 14,000 persons that could be counted as such. The government's Great Return program involves accommodating some 140,000 IDPs by the end of 2026. Given the current pace, it does not seem likely that this target will be met. The Azerbaijani government has been spending billions of dollars on this program. It also pressured some 100,000 Armenians who lived in Nagorno-Karabakh to leave in a process that some organizations have criticized as ethnic cleansing.
And that's all on this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.